For the EFD, Mr. Bloom has 2 minutes.
Commissioner, Mr. President, I rise again, I'm afraid, to make the same old hoary speech that I've been making here for several years, and that is, it is my opinion that you do not really understand the concept of banking. All the banks are broke. Bank Santander, Deutsche Bank, Royal Bank of Scotland, they're all broke. And why are they broke? It isn't an act of God. It isn't some sort of tsunami. They're broke because we have a system called fractional reserve banking, which means that banks can lend money that they don't actually have. It's a criminal scandal, and it's been going on for too long. To add to that problem, you have moral hazard, a very significant moral hazard from the political sphere. And most of the problem starts in politics and central banks, which are part of the same political system. We have counterfeiting, sometimes called quantitative easing, but counterfeiting by any other name. The artificial printing of money, which if any ordinary person did, they'd go to prison for a very long time. And yet governments and central banks do it all the time. Central banks repress the amount of interest that rates are, so we don't have the real cost of money. And yet we blame the real retail banks for manipulating LIBOR. The sheer effrontery of this is quite astonishing. It's central banks that manipulate interest rates, Commissioner. And plus, underneath all this, we talk loosely, in a rather cavalier fashion, do we not, about deposit guarantees. So when banks go broke through their own incompetence and chicanery, the taxpayer picks up the tab. It's theft from the taxpayer. And until we start sending bankers, and I include central bankers and politicians, to prison for this outrage, it will continue.
Grazie per il gruppo.
3, 4. Hello everybody and welcome to this edition of Naughty Step TV. I'm Gerard Batten, and today I'm going to be talking to Godfrey Bloom, who was a colleague of mine in the European Parliament and in UKIP for many years. Now, you saw that tremendous speech from Godfrey in the European Parliament, and they were always a pleasure to listen to, while Godfrey told us how the central banks and the finance ministers of most countries in the world are a bunch of crooks. All very entertaining and, of course, very true and pertinent to what was going on. And what I want to do today is to talk to Godfrey about the current economic and financial situation and where we think we're headed in the world. Now, as I said, I was a member of the European Parliament for 15 years. Godfrey, I think you were there from 2004 to 2009, weren't you?
2004 to 2014, in fact.
Right, okay, so you were there, you did 2 terms, and you were UKIP spokesman on economics, I think, as well, weren't you?
Yes, I sat on the Economics and Monetary Affairs Committee.
Right, okay, so one of the things I was going to do first of all then is to ask you to briefly tell us a bit about yourself and your credentials, if you like, for actually talking about economics and finance, because you have long experience. I think we should tell the viewers a little bit about that.
Oh, certainly. I started in the city in 1967 at Lloyd's of London brokerage, and I transferred from underwriting into investment, and I've been in investment and finance in some form since then in the city, and I retired from that in 2004 in order to go into politics. So I've had a very considerable period of time in the field of investment and finance and money and all the related things. I managed a fixed interest fund for some years, to which I was very fortunate to win an international prize for my fund, although I did that with some very, very good assistance from some of my people. So I can't claim all the credit for that, but it was my fund and it was very successful. So I've been in and around the city financial services for most of my life.
Thanks, Godfrey. So I suppose what we want to talk about today is the current financial and economic situation, the state of government spending, what the lockdown is going to do to the economy in terms of jobs and public services and taxation revenue and those kind of things. Are we headed, I suppose the crux of what we're going to be talking about today is, are we headed for another financial and economic crash? But I'd like to kick off, because I know that key to this is your views on how banks create money. And you actually wrote a book called The Magic of Banking and How Banks Create Money Out of Thin Air. So would you like to tell us a bit about that book?
Certainly, yes. Most people know that they're sort of vaguely being conned by the money and banking system, but they're not really quite sure how it's being done, because your butcher, your baker, your surgeon, your barrister is an expert in other fields, but he knows something isn't quite right, but he can never quite put his finger on it. And of course, as soon as they invented paper money, which there's a lot of historical argument about it, it goes back to China perhaps in the Middle Ages, but nobody really quite knows. But as soon as, paper money was only a promissory note to pay in gold. And oldies, any really oldies watching this will know that a banknote promised to pay the bearer on demand the sum in gold, because it was a promissory note, and the note was just so that people didn't have to lug gold about with all the danger and the value and the heaviness of all that kind of thing. Now, fast forwarding on that very quickly, Nixon took the reserve currency of the world, the dollar, off the gold standard in 1971. So the dollar didn't represent gold anymore. It was just fiat currency, paper currency of no intrinsic worth. And of course, since that time in 1971, we've seen the purchasing power of the dollar fall by 96%. And of course, as a reserve currency, all other currencies fallen by that or more, including sterling, which is why oldies like me can remember paying 11 old pence for a pint of bitter when they were young men at the rugby club. And now in London, it's £4. That is the degradation of money, and that is what banks, central banks and politicians conspire to do.
I think that's very interesting. Now, come on real money and the gold standard a bit later on, I'd like to, Godfrey. I think that there were very good reasons why paper money was introduced historically. And I think there's a bit of a difference between using paper money as a promissory note, as it were, and what banks actually do, which is create it out of thin air. And in fact, I think I remember reading 40 odd years ago, the Consumer Society by John Kenneth Galbraith, in which he said, when the Dutch invented this, I think they were the first people to have a central bank that did this back in the 17th century. It was the biggest contract ever foisted on the public. So we come on to that a little bit later on about how banks create money. But a question that's always occurred to me on this, because lots of people talk to me about this and, fiat money and we should have real money. But if central banks can create money out of nothing, but charge governments interest on the money that they just created, why don't governments just create the money themselves?
Well, yes, they could do that, but of course they need a facility. And of course the central bank, what we must bear in mind, the central bank isn't independent. There's a lot of talk about the central banks being independent, but they're not. The Bank of England, our central bank, its staff, its governors and everyone are actually chosen by the Chancellor of the Exchequer. So it's a very political organisation. So one might argue that governments do actually print the money themselves, and they disseminate it amongst the central bank, which is the Bank of Last Lending Reserve, to retail banks. So governments do actually create the money. It's just that they need a conduit for them to do that. And it's the banking system that does it.
Except that they're then paying the bankers interest on the money that they've just created. What's always occurred to me is, well, why not cut out the middleman and not add the interest?
Yes, but it doesn't matter, because all they do is they create more money in order to pay the interest anyway. So it's all fake. It's all smoke and mirrors. So it doesn't really matter, because don't forget, it's created. There's no chance of this debt ever being paid off. You know, it's trillions of pounds. It's beyond human imagination. So it really doesn't matter what number you stick on it. It's never going to be paid off anyway.
Well, that kind of leads me into what I was going to ask next, which is the state of, or the current level of UK government borrowing and spending, which has gone up. I mean, we already had, I think it was about 1.7 trillion in national debt. I think that's gone up to 2 trillion now, roughly. And I saw that America has gone up from something like 20 trillion. And I think I saw a figure recently about 27 trillion. What's this? Have you any idea what the current government figures are for borrowing money and spending, and how this has gone up? And given what's happening with the lockdown and furlough payments and everything, how much more that is going to climb?
Well, the estimate at the moment is that the lockdown situation, the COVID situation, has increased government debt by 10%. But at the moment, that's something of a ballpark figure. Let's look at what we do know. When the government goes, the Chancellor goes every year, he goes to the country and talks about his budget statement. What he doesn't do is present to the nation the accounts as he would have to do if he were representing a public limited company. So, for example, he comes and he tells us that the national debt perhaps is XYZ, which is 90% of GDP, which is another fake figure, and so on and so forth. But of course, in that figure, he does not put down the estimates for the liability of public sector pensions and public funding initiatives. So it's a fake figure. So if you go to the Institute of Economic Affairs onto their website and get the real figure, you'll see that it's nearer 200% of GDP, which is in and around the same figure as Greece. So the country is in far more debt than anybody will actually admit to or understand. But of course, mainstream media don't understand it. They don't have any serious economists or researchers on their teams. So consequently, they don't understand this. But of course, we are getting into debt, more and more debt every year as the borrowing increases and the spending increases. And what is interesting, we've supposed to have a fiscally conservative government. The Conservatives always have suggested that they're fiscally conservative. But we have seen the national debt double in the last 8 years, which was under a Tory administration. So the Conservative Party are no better party when it comes to spending money. But of course, if you think about it, spending other people's money is desperately easy, isn't it? And if you don't believe it, ask my wife. She finds it terribly easy to go out with my bank statements and my credit cards, easy peasy. And of course, this is what government does. And because governments are only in power for 5 years and Chancellor's probably only at the helm for 5 or 6 years at most, they'll be long gone when the reckoning is there to be paid. And of course, when we had the collapse in 2007, 2008, with monetized debt and all the rest of it, nothing was changed. Nothing was changed in 2007 and 8. We didn't change the banking system. We didn't try and curtail government spending or anything like that in 2007 and 8. So now the national debt, global debt, corporate debt, sovereign debt is 3 times what it was in 2007. As I say, it's beyond the human imagination. When you talk about the Fed, America, 22, 23 trillion, they fake their figures as well. It's actually a lot more than that on Medicaid and so on and so forth. They spend £1 trillion a year on their military budget. So these figures are beyond human imagination. It's a little bit when you watch a program, an astronomy program, on outer space, and they talk about the distances of planets and other galaxies. They're beyond human imagination. And I'm afraid our debt now is beyond our human imagination. I've been in financial services now for over 40 years, and it's beyond my imagination. I can't conceive these figures at all.
Yes, because you mentioned there if they did a really genuine accounts every year, because one of the things I don't count is the unfunded liabilities like public pensions. For example, I understand that takes up an enormous proportion of the public debt, and also then the interest that we're paying on the public debt. Now, it's hardly up to, I'm not going to criticize anybody for getting a public pension, because I'm getting one for having been a member of the European Parliament. But I think that these are, especially in local authority pensions schemes, these are more or less unsustainable, aren't they, Godfrey?
Of course, they are, because they're funded by the wealth creating sector. They're not funded in the sense that a private pension is funded. These are a debt on the wealth creating sector. And let me give you a little anecdote, if I may. In my village, I live in a village of only 120 souls in the East Riding of Yorkshire. Very, very tiny village. In our village, we have 9 retired civil servants. They tend to retire early. I worked out, because I used to do this for a living and I'm a bit of a geek, that those 8 or 9 people alone account for something like £8 million worth of pensions if you had to buy that on the open market from the Prudential. or a big insurance company. They're index linked. You can't even get that in the private sector now. So in my tiny village alone, there is a debt to the wealth creating sector of 8 million, and probably more than that. And of course, it means it's paid for by your butcher, your baker, your joiner, your sparky, all the little people that actually make up 85% of our economy have to dig deep to find that. And it gets more every year, which is why you go, whenever you go out and have dinner, or you have a weekend at a reasonably nice hotel in the Dales or the Lake District, it's absolutely full of retired civil servants spending like drunken sailors on shore leave with their brand new Honda Jazz in the car park. These people are living at everybody else's expense, and we can't go on like this. If you go back to the Spanish Empire in the 1600s, you find that one young man out of 3 were in holy orders, totally non-protective holy orders. And we have now people who are simply not in productive employment at all. So we can't go on. Of course, this can't go on.
Yes, that's very interesting. But also, for example, I'll give you a personal example. I worked for British Telecom for 28 years, and we had an index-linked pension there, which is no longer available to people. And that actually built up an excess. So when Gordon Brown was Chancellor, what he did is actually plundered that and taxed it. So, and this actually caused the BT pension fund then to be, I think it went into kind of debit. Whereas it could have been in credit, and it could have taken a holiday and left that money to one side. But out of his greed to spend money, he actually took that money out of a private pension fund, spent it, and then jeopardized the BT pension fund thereafter. I don't know what the current state is. It's paying my pension, so I presumably it's ticking over. But this was another example of how they misuse money that they have access to. What I would say, you mentioned GDP. I think it might be a good idea to explain the difference between GDP, the value of the economy, and what I always think is the real, you can tell me if I'm wrong here, the real indicator of wealth, which is the per capita share and income in a country. So you can have a country of 66 million like the UK, and a massive GDP that keeps going up because we keep importing more people to work in coffee shops and sell copies of The Big Issue. But other countries like Norway, which is of a tiny population compared to us, actually have a higher per capita standard of living. Do you want to say a word about that?
Yes, certainly. Let me just quickly pick up on the point on your BT pension fund, because Gordon Brown didn't understand pensions at all. And I actually did a BBC programme, Today programme in the morning, and they didn't understand it either. Pension schemes, final salary pension schemes, BT, for example, is paid for out of dividends, out of the dividend income. The capital value of a pension fund is neither here nor there. It's the income stream is how you pay out your pensions. And so what he did, he looked at a capital value, which looked like it might be higher than it needed to be, but he didn't look at the dividend income. And of course, the stock market and bond market goes up and down. So you can't judge a pension scheme on that basis. And that's a mistake he made. And when I explained it to the, would you believe I had to explain it to the Saturday Financial Times? The Financial Times didn't understand. I was managing pensions for the biggest pension fund manager in those days in Europe. And they didn't understand that mainstream media and the government didn't understand how they work, which is now, and it killed, his actions killed private sector pensions. There are no index-linked private sector schemes left at all. So I just want to clear up on that point.
I know. I mean, this is dreadful what he did, because he actually destroyed the pension prospects.
We had the strongest pension scheme in the world. We had the strongest private pension schemes funded in the world. And second to us was Holland, and he destroyed it in one term of office as Chancellor. Yeah. It was fascinating, and he got away with it because the BBC, public service broadcasting and mainstream media are too stupid to understand how they work. He stole our pensions in absolute silence. Disgraceful.
As well as part of our gold reserves as well, which of course.
Well, yes, of course, but I mean now even it doesn't. Even your bartenders and your everybody who was unassociated now with financial services know that that was a huge mistake. He sold it for $250 an ounce, which is when I started buying it personally for my portfolio.
Thank you, Gordon. I picked up quite a lot at rock bottom prices, so perhaps he's not all bad after all. But the point you make of on GDP, just picking up on GDP, gross domestic product, which is fascinating because the bimbos on TV, they look at the screen and they see, oh, well, GDP has gone up by 0.5% or something of this nature. And these bimbos don't understand what GDP means. GDP is just a measure of measuring, it just measures activity. It doesn't measure profit. It doesn't measure anything at all. It's meaningless. It's a state-invented system in which to con the public, GDP. You can't gauge it. You can't understand it. It's not a measure of wealth. It's not a measure of well-being or anything at all. So yes, picking up on the point that you asked, which is if you bring in more people to the country every year, and if we stay settle on 300,000 new people coming in every year, immigration, yes, because they will increase activity. They will increase GDP, which is a meaningless number anyway, but you've got another 300,000 people wanting NHS, wanting health, wanting schools, wanting somewhere to live and everything else. So it doesn't expand the pie. It's just more people at the table. Now I'm not anti certain sorts of immigration, incidentally. I think we've at the moment we have a small holding in Yorkshire, and if it hadn't been for the Latvian dude and his couple of his chums who are digging up all the drains and making it, and by goodness me, they're experts, and it's a reasonable charge and all this that they win. He's been here for some time. These guys are really useful. The immigrants we don't want, we see arriving at Dover every day. So there's immigration and immigration. Some of it is useful and some of it is not useful. But if we bring the right people in, of course, they increase the size of the pie more than their consumption of the pie. But we haven't seen that happening particularly. And of course, our welfare system pays for people who don't work. We have a system where we pay people for not working. So the whole welfare system, what we have really is that we need a complete reform of the way we handle money, who gets money, and so on and so forth. And at the moment, we're just not doing that, which is why the debt increases every year.
Yeah, I mean, this is it. I mean, a lot of our indigenous population is actually disincentivized from working because they're worse off if they work. And of course, this is the point that we were trying to make in UKIP for 27 years. Which is that there's nothing wrong with immigration, but it should be limited, controlled, and discriminatory in the real sense of the word, which is who do we want, why do we want them, rather than just having an open door. But of course, we all know in public dialogue led by the mainstream media now, anyone that says anything about immigration is automatically a racist. You can't have a reasoned debate about that any more than you can have a reasoned debate about anything else. And I think the reason that they maybe it wasn't so much that they don't understand the points that you were making about the pensions and the economy, is that they don't want to because they're all doctrinaire socialists anyway.
Almost certainly. And of course, the BBC pension is index linked, underwritten by the taxpayer. Not something they're likely to criticise, is it?
No, exactly. Now, I wanted to come on there then. Are we expecting another recession or depression? How bad is it going to be? But just to come on, because you mentioned the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And I want to know what you think the parallels are between what happened then and what's happening now. Because my understanding of how that came about, very briefly, was the economy was regulated after the Great Depression of 1929 onwards. They actually brought in this Glass-Steagall Act, which said that banks couldn't speculate, basically couldn't gamble with their investors' money. Back in the 80s, Ronald Reagan, I think, relaxed regulation. It was even further relaxed under Clinton. And then what you had was precisely what wasn't supposed to happen, which was banks were gambling with their investors' money. That got worse when you had the subprime mortgage phenomenon, when mortgages were being sold to people that couldn't afford to pay them back. Then they were being bundled up in these CDOs, capitalized debt obligation. So it's basically a financial product that was put out on the market. The people that sold it had no interest in whether the people who were taking out those loans and mortgages could pay them back or not, because they were earning enormous bonuses. This was then underwritten by AIG, the big American insurance company, so that they were covered on insurance. But of course, when the financial recession came and people couldn't pay back, the whole system was about to crash. So the Americans had to bail out AIG and the economy to the tune of billions and billions of pounds. But none of those bankers who were quite possibly guilty of fraud ever had to account for this. Not just the bankers, but the people who were selling these mortgages, who knew that they were fraudulent, they wouldn't necessarily be able to be paid back. Nothing happened to those people. And in fact, the whole system stayed the same. But how much did it stay the same? Are those things still going on to the extent that they did? And if we do have a recession or a depression, will it be due to the same reasons, or part of those reasons and new factors that we're not taking into account at the moment? What are we headed for, a big recession and a depression? And if so, what is the key driving force behind that if it happens?
One of the problems that we had was under Carter. If you go back to President Carter, an act came in America called the Community Investment Act, I think it was called. And what actually that meant was that you couldn't make inquiries on a sound banking system because they would be seen to be racist or discriminatory. So, for example, you couldn't ask what a man's credit rating was. You couldn't ask what his credit background was. You weren't allowed to ask all the questions that normally prudent investment bankers would do. So you couldn't ask those questions. Those questions became illegal. So consequently, it freed up everybody being able to get a mortgage because you didn't really have to fill a form in. So consequently, the banks sold plenty of mortgages which were unrepayable, but it was originally a political dynamic. It wasn't a banking dynamic, it was a political dynamic. But you're quite right about the Glass-Steagall Act and the split between the two things. But you see, they were put down as asset-backed. So when they were bundled up, people who were buying them, so you have your naive pension fund managers who were buying those kind of things, thinking that they bought a surgeon's house mortgage in Arlington, and they weren't. They were buying a trailer in South Chicago. But they didn't dig deep enough to find out what these things. And of course, Standard and Poor and Moody's and the credit ratings were giving them A and AA ratings. So the number of people to blame here is go right back, politicians, bankers, all to blame. And if you go back to the 1929 recession, but you need to go back even beyond that. You need to go back further. You have to go back to the 1921 administration of Warren Harding, who in 1921, there was a beginning of another very deep recession, potentially depression. And he said, no, America's living beyond its means. So he massively cut United States spending. His successor was Calvin Coolidge, who was very laissez-faire, and he did the same thing. But then that was rescinded, got out of control, and what we had then was a credit crunch, which was the 1929, which was perpetuated by Roosevelt, who made a real mess of it. They put Roosevelt on a pedestal in America. He was economically the most incompetent president they've ever had. The recession over there lasted for nearly 10 years because he wouldn't let the market sort itself out. And the technical term for this, Gerard, is creative destruction. You have to let companies go to the wall. You have to let things go to the wall. You can't keep them up zombie-like with public money. It will sooner or later the reckoning comes. You cannot keep industries going if they are not like the Soviet Union found out. You can't go on subsidizing interest, and you have to move on. And creative destruction, that was something that Roosevelt didn't allow to happen. Now, are we going into a recession now? Of course we are. It isn't COVID. COVID is just the trigger to this. Yeah. COVID is just a trigger. This has triggered it, but this isn't the reason for it. It's because everything's been built on debt and free money. The cost of money is zero. So you're seeing money being squandered and spent by corporations and people, money that they don't have, money that's digitally manufactured. This can't go on. So this was going to end sooner or later. Yes, we're going into a recession. I can't see how it can't be a depression, but the trigger was COVID, but that's not the reason. You can't live on fresh air forever, and I think that's a lesson that we're going to find out very soon.
Yeah, but I think the main driving force won't be so much now that the financial institutions are selling dodgy loans, but it's got to be the combined effect of government borrowing and spending, which is unsustainable, but also the fact that now they're crashing the economy with the lockdown. Now, how do you think that what's happening with the lockdown. I mean, people now have got used to not going to work, and you can't blame if somebody's got a job they don't really like, which isn't particularly well paid, and they're getting 80% of what they would normally get for staying at home, and they think, well, by the time I haven't paid my train fare and bought lunch and whatever incidentals, I'm just as well off as I was when I was working. So these people have now got out of the habit of working and don't want to go back. And of course, we all see what's happening with the teachers. They don't want to go back, and probably that's better for the kids if they're not indoctrinated with extreme left-wing ideology. So they might be better off sitting at home, and my personal view. But people are going to get out of the habit, and I fear that a lot of the little businesses and whatever that I used to use, which have not opened since this started, are not actually going to reopen because people maybe turn up, expect their job to be there, and the owner's going to say, "I'm sorry, we went bust a month or two ago."
This is the problem because the country, the electorate, and this is true of Western Europe and certainly Western Europe, have disassociated the idea with money being anything to do with them. They think the government has money, of its own money. People are filling in their forms with furloughs or with self-employed help, all the bits and pieces, thinking that somehow the government has money that they're going to send them, not realizing that governments can only raise it through tax, borrowing, or printing, which degrades it. And most people don't understand that. Goodness me, how could the man on the Clapham omnibus understand that when your professors in universities professing to know economics don't understand that? They are Keynesian economists. They're all utterly stupid. I've lectured at more universities than you could shake a stick at, and I go to the bar afterwards. I've never met a single academic who even remotely understands how money works, and they get the next generation coming on. You end up then with the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The current Chancellor of the Exchequer, very nice guy, I've met him, Ricky Tikki Tavi, I nickname him. He's a very nice man, but he doesn't seem to understand that sooner or later, all this money he's spending, all this check writing, I mean, vouchers for eating out. I mean, this guy's off the wall, isn't he? Boris hasn't a clue. And if you look at a close photograph at the moment of Boris, he doesn't look like he has a clue. He's away with the fairies. And of course, only very slowly are people beginning to understand that the reckoning will come. Not the civil servants, not the public sector who haven't gone back to work. And you say 80% of their pay. No. These characters have been at home on full pay. Yeah. And they haven't turned up again. And they haven't turned up. I mean, it doesn't really matter because they didn't do anything when they were at work, except get in our way. Now, what, of course, Boris should have done, he was saying, we can't afford to, all the civil servants and the public sector spending. What we've got to do is slash public spending, slash the number of civil servants. But what did he do? He came out and said, we need more of them. We're going to give them a pay rise. Absolutely, I mean, crazy. Just the one opportunity to show everybody that we could cut back, like Warren Harding did and Calvin Coolidge, to take a grip of the economy. Any Yorkshire housewife could run the economy better than Ricky Tikki Tavi and his predecessor and the predecessor before that.
Okay, well, I think money is quite a mysterious thing when you try to pin down what it's a bit like time. For the physicist, it's a bit of a mystery when you try to explain it, because we all knew what money was 500 years ago when it was gold and silver coins, but then we moved into paper money. And of course, now money is just numbers on a computer. You don't even have to print the stuff. I think I saw a figure that the amount of notes and coins in circulation is only about 3% of the total amount of money that exists, because most of it is just a number on a computer, which brings me on to something that people often talk to me about, what I did when I was an MEP, this idea of sound money. What is sound money? How would you create it? And I think you mentioned this already about going back onto the gold standard. Would you like to say something about that? What your views are on that?
Well, money, first of all, what we need to do is we need to define what money is. Money is a medium of exchange in which people will exchange goods or services. So people would exchange goods or services for what they perceive to be money. And if you go back far enough, you go back 6,000 years, it was salt. But for the last 5,000 years, it's been gold. It's when people have the confidence to accept it, it's a store of wealth. So if you put away gold coins now, for example, in 5 years' time, those gold coins will buy you what they will buy you today. Gold isn't in an investment. Gold isn't an investment, gold is money. And JP Morgan said in 1926, only gold is money. And when a dollar bill or a pound bill or a franc, the gold franc, a piece of paper says, yes, we've got the gold, it's in storage, it's at the bank. And as soon as you stop doing that, all you've got is an intrinsically worthless piece of paper. And of course, we saw that in the Weimar Republic when it was just paper, it had no intrinsic value. And we saw that most recently, of course, we've seen it in Zimbabwe and the Lebanon. It's just printed paper. It's meaningless. It doesn't buy anything. And Argentina had the same problem with the peso. So money is what you will exchange. And if we go on degrading money, when you go into your pub for your pint, your landlord will say, no, I don't want a £10 note for that now, or a £20 note. I don't want that. That's no good to me. I know you've got some eggs, Godfrey. You keep your own chickens. Can I have a couple of dozen eggs? Or you've got a nice watch. I tell you what, can I have your watch and I'll pour you free beer for the rest of the week, or something like that. We'll go back to barter. But of course, with the gold, if you have a gold coin, let's take I have one in I have a 1905 gold sovereign. 1905. That gold sovereign, which was the equivalent of a pound coin in 1905, will buy you today what it bought in 1905, which is beg breakfast and an evening meal and a bottle of plonk. It'll buy you today, because it's a sovereign this morning is about 380 quid. So that's it's money. That's money. Paper isn't money. When people stop accepting it for goods and services, it ceases to become money, and only gold is money, or maybe silver. So consequently, there's only one way to go, and that's downhill.
Okay, but wasn't the reason that the French moved to paper money in about early 1720s, I think it was, because the economy was expanding rapidly and they didn't have enough gold to back up what they needed for commerce, so they moved to paper money. Wasn't that the reason why paper money came about? Because basically there wasn't enough gold. Could you move back to the gold standard now? Is there enough, given that Gordon Brown sold a lot of it off anyway, is there enough gold, for example, in the UK or the US or major Western European countries to actually back up the system if they had to?
Oh, yes. And the paper money created by Law, John Law, who ironically was a Scotsman, was that, you know, there's enough gold if you index it right. So, for example, if you have a dollar bill, now you have to regauge. So if a dollar bill, when gold, in 1971, when we closed the gold window, Nixon closed the gold window, was at, let's say, $35 an ounce. If my memory serves me, which might be slightly wrong, $35 an ounce. Well, now it's $2,000 an ounce. You have to acknowledge that fall in paper money against gold. So if you go back to the gold standard, you have to recalibrate. You must recalibrate what gold is. So if there's enough gold, if, say, for example, gold went to $5,000 an ounce, there's enough gold. When you calibrate it, what you can't do is you can't recalibrate it to what it was in 1971. And that's a mistake that they made in the late 1920s and 30s, when some people tried to go back onto the gold standard to recalibrate it to 1913. You can't do that. But you can recalibrate it.
Well, that comes on to a couple of other points on this. Firstly, when the French went on to paper money in the early 1700s, and when Roosevelt did the same thing in 1934, I think, they actually banned the holding of gold. It became illegal to hold gold, and you had to hand it over and get the equivalent paper money, which, of course, if it's all been devalued, isn't much of a bargain. So that's one thing that I fear that governments might do if there was a real serious economic crash. I did read an article very recently in which it speculated, and I've no idea whether there's anything in this or not, that President Trump was thinking of going back onto the gold standard and valuing it at about $10,000 an ounce. I mean, have you any comment on those 2 points?
Well, politicians who suggest this, the trouble is politicians, they always cheat, and central bankers always cheat. So he could do that and then he'd just cheat again. They can't help themselves. Got to bear in mind, politicians can't help themselves. They're sociopaths. Bankers are sociopaths. They don't care about ordinary people. They've always got their hand in the till and it never affects them. So this is the sort of problem that we have. So going back to the gold standard might be a good idea, but we know that they'll start cheating again. I would argue what we need is something which is called free banking. And it's not what you might understand from free banking, i.e. they don't charge you. But what we need is to be able to use whatever currency is you think is appropriate. So, for example, if you go to Zimbabwe and you've got a pocket full of United States dollars, you'll find that you can do plenty of good business. You'll be able to buy whatever goods and services you need. But Zimbabwe dollars will be no good to you. So what we need to do is open up globally, or certainly European-wise, or certainly from the United Kingdom's perspective. You can go into any shop and trade in any currency that you like. And if somebody thinks that if you're going to buy something with a currency which is on the slide, which I think you're going to find is firstly going to happen to the United States dollar, you're going to find that people would sooner have something else. So it doesn't matter what that something else is. It doesn't matter. That's not the point. Can they move it on for goods and services? Is it a store of value? A store of value, say a dollar bill, we know isn't a store of value because we've seen it degraded by 96% in my lifetime. Not a store of value. So we have to bear all these things in mind. It's only a medium of exchange. If I may plug my book, The Magic of Banking, for a second, I explain money in a chapter. Before I even go on to gold, I explain money. And you can't move on until you understand, and everybody's got to understand what money really is before they move on, thinking what an alternative might be.
How can people get a copy of your book?
On Amazon, Magic of Banking, Amazon. It's,
when I say
book, it's an aid memoir. It's been designed quite carefully that you can, it's for the layman, the intelligent layman. It's 40 minutes. You can actually read it in 40 minutes, and it's got color charts because busy professional people don't have time to sit and read a huge, great, fat book. They just want to know how the bloody system works. How does it work? How am I being screwed? And how can I avoid being screwed? And I did a chapter on gold, and it first came out, the first edition was in 2015. If they took my advice, they would have put a very significant amount of their savings into gold at somewhere in the region of $1,000 an ounce. I still get letters of thank you from people who bought the first edition.
Yeah. If let's say then that there is a depression, that the economy has to go back onto the gold standard, how would that affect the ordinary person, the person with a mortgage who maybe worked many years, who's got a bit of savings? Are they going to see their wealth wiped out? How do you think it would affect the ordinary person in the street?
Well, a lot of people with savings, have seen their savings wiped out already by not being on the gold standard. So if you were saving money, if you look at people now, maybe 80 who had a nest egg when they were 65, they've seen the spending power, the purchasing power, that probably disappear by at least 2/3, probably more. So the people who get hit by the degradation, inflation of money are old age pensioners, people on fixed incomes, people on minimum wages, and people with savings. They've been murdered. So there is no easy way out of this. We're not going to find an easy way out of this because we've been living beyond our means. We've been living on tick now for 2 generations. There is no way out of this, but there is a possibility. There's light at the end of the tunnel if we had a government like Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge who would say, we have got to absolutely get rid of public. We've got to reduce government spending by 75%, enormous. We've got to get rid of unnecessary regulations. We've got to make it easy for people, the entrepreneur, to start a business from scratch without being burdened with lots and lots of regulations, and rejig the economy that way. And that's the only way we're going to pull out of it. The state is the problem. The state is not the solution. The state is the problem. The state's been the problem, and central banks and bankers have been the problem now since I was born.
Yeah, I want to come on to that on the last question, really, about how to fix the problems. Would you like to say something about the stock market? Because I have a very jaundiced view about the stock market since I got wiped out in 2001. I was very interested in I was watching a video recently about the crash in 2008 and how Goldman Sachs were very much manipulating what went on there. And I very well remember British Telecom shares went up, I think they were 11 quid. And Goldman Sachs said, oh, they're undervalued. They're going to go up to 15 quid. So I bought quite a lot. And then, of course, the following week, they all declined. And now I think they're about £2.50 on a good day. So my view is that the whole of the stock market is a big racket run by the big people at the top who fleece the unsuspecting when they feel that the time is right to do it. One of the things that I've seen recently regarding the stock market is that although a lot of money has been pumped into companies in America under the these moves that Trump is trying to do to stabilize the economy, a lot of it has gone to the really big companies who are using it to buy shares. And of course, the really big companies like Amazon and Google and these really big players, they're very stable because they've got millions or billions in the bank. They can outride this crisis. But the smaller companies, and we've seen this in America, I know it's slightly different in America regarding filing for bankruptcy. And it's something that companies do in order to survive. But a lot of companies, and I saw some big names like Pizza Hut and Hertz that actually filed for bankruptcy because they are companies that depend upon a daily, weekly cash flow in order to keep going. So I suppose my question is, what's your view on the stock market? Because it seems to be buoyant at the moment. And I'm sorry, but I'm very much a cynic about this. And all that tells me is the people who really control it are getting ready to fleece all the mugs who put their money in at the moment. Am I too cynical? What's your view on the stock market?
Well, I manage bonds, of course, not stocks, fixed interest. But the point is, your real inflation, your problem overvalued is the bond market at the moment. Let's talk about the bond market. So there are bonds on the market, which is artificial money is flooding into bonds, which are paying either 0 or 1%, and Swiss and German bonds are paying negative interest rates. Yeah. So we are due for a massive crash in the bond market, and bond markets will crash the stock market, and because the inflation, monetary inflation, which we have at the moment, creates asset price inflation. And that inflation, that monetary inflation, is going into assets via the banks. So this is the problem that we have. So yes, there must be a stock market crash. There always is boom and bust in stock markets and bond markets. And we're overdue for another one because this is how the system works. So certainly, if Goldman Sachs ever tell you to do something, do the opposite.
Yeah, I know that.
They're all crooks. They're known in the city. We knew them, and I worked for an investment bank, which was pretty sharp, the SG Warburg Empire, pretty damn sharp operators. But the Goldman Sachs were known as the vampire squid. They have a hand, or a tentacle, rather, in every pocket. They fiddled the Greek figures for the Greeks to join the euro. They lobotomize and corrupt everybody who works for them. Ricky Tikki Tavi, incidentally, is one. And Goldman Sachs were telling you that gold wouldn't go above $1,200 2 years ago in order to fill their own boots with it, because I didn't take any notice of them at all. But you have these dodgy banks, and how do they get away with it? Well, they pick up failed politicians. So they pick up people like, not Goldman Sachs, but George Osborne at £500,000 a year. What did he do to get that? They pick up the Barroso, works for Goldman Sachs, and Brown works for Morgan Stanley or Morgan Grenfell, I can't remember. But all these chancellors, when they finish their term, go and work for an investment bank on monster salaries. So they all piss in the same pot, Gerard. They're all crooks. They're all vagabonds.
Yeah, not only that, they've the big businesses corrupted academia as well, because a lot of these economists with universities are also on the payroll doing consultancy for the big banks. So you can't trust what they say either, I don't think, even if you can understand it.
Don't forget, you've got to bear in mind, if you look at the strategic aspect, all big businesses hate small businesses.
Yeah.
Small businesses.
Well, we enough in the European Parliament, didn't we?
Yeah, and small business, self-employed people and small businesses account for something like over 70% of the economy of the United Kingdom. So consequently, politicians find them difficult to manipulate because they're small. They can't get at them. and they don't like it. Politicians and big business don't like people they can't control. And the best way of controlling things is big business and politicians and banks in cahoots with each other, which is fascism. And I don't use that as a pejorative term. That is a political system. It's big business, banks and politicians in cahoots. And that's what we actually have at the moment. And high regulation. Big business loves regulation. Big business loves regulation. Don't forget, big business can afford a human resource department full of very highly paid professionals. If you're running a 10-man business down the road in East Yorkshire, you can't afford that kind of expertise. So consequently, there's a problem, and that's got to wash away. We've got to get rid of all this.
Well, I think it was Mussolini that said, really, fascism should be called corporatism because it's an alliance of political power with big business. And just for the benefit of the viewer to this, while we were in the European Parliament, what we saw all the time was legislation coming through that benefited big business because they could comply with it, because they had the means of complying with it, but actually made life harder all the time for small and medium-sized businesses because it was another thing, another burden on their back that they had to contend with. And this was a message I was constantly trying to get through during my 15 years as an MEP, that the European Union is actually anti, as you've just made the point, anti the small and medium-sized businesses. And yet they're the backbone of the economy because I think they employ 90%, something of that region, of people who actually work, who are employed by a small or medium-sized business. And of course, for most youngsters, it's how they get their first step on the work ladder. As I did, nearly 50 years ago, you get a low-paid, menial job, but it allows you to work, it allows you to earn, it allows you to get that next job on the ladder. And what we're seeing now is kids who can't work, who can't get a decent job, and even the kids with university degrees can't get jobs. And once they're getting past about 25 and they haven't had a steady job, they're becoming unemployable. And I think that's an absolute shocking disgrace and a crime against humanity, quite frankly.
You're quite right, Joe, which is why at the Brexit referendum, you couldn't find a single small or medium-sized business who was doing anything other than vote for Brexit unless they had a lot of their business was going to the continent. And of course, they were very few. Yeah. Most people don't sell anything to the continent because they don't buy anything of ours. Yeah. So it's very small. So your butcher, your baker, your sparky, your candlestick maker, all people in small business voted to leave because they were the ones that are being screwed by EU regulation. And that's how we did it. It wasn't every single civil servant voted Remain. Yeah. Big business wanted to remain. The banks wanted to vote Remain. It was the ordinary little guys that voted for leave, but as you say, paradoxically, ironically, the backbone of the economy, which still to this day is something which, how can it possibly be right to have the same employment legislation for Tesco and the shop on the corner? How can that conceivably be right?
Yeah, it's crazy. And of course, this brings me on to my next question, really, Godfrey, about the penultimate question, because this is the one question, then the final question. We both worked for Brexit for, 27 years, 28, if you still count now what we're saying. We were both in it from the start in UKIP, and we got the referendum. But how do you think that the current economic situation is going to affect Brexit? My view has always been that they have no intention of delivering a real Brexit anyway. The referendum was kind of a strategic mistake that they made. They had to go through with it, but we're actually going to see a 50 or 40% Brexit, and all it's doing is lining us up to be taken back in at a later date by another government. And I have a very, very jaundiced and cynical view of this because I've been watching it for too long, from 1972. They're all liars when it comes to this. The Tories are the biggest liars of the lot. But that to one side for a moment, whether you agree with it or not. But how do you think the current economic situation is going to affect Brexit, or will it help it or impair it?
It could help it. It could help it enormously if it's regarded as an opportunity. And I don't believe our senior politicians regard it as an opportunity. They regard it as something to make the best of a bad job. I regard it as a magnificent opportunity because it can free us as you know, 2,000 new regulations a year were coming out of Brussels. If we're freed from 2,000 new regulations a year, that could be a wonderful opportunity. It frees us from a lot of the fiscal responsibility to the European Union. Yes, you're right. I don't trust them either. But there's another dynamic now, and it's a very much more serious dynamic than it was even when we were in office, or I was in office when I finished in 2014. And that it is clearly inevitable that the European Union is going to collapse now. We know that it's a question of time. We don't quite know when it's going to collapse, but it's going to collapse because the ECB are in just as much trouble as the Bank of England and the Fed by borrowing sovereign debt. We have Target 2, the banking system, which is to the tune of £1 trillion in debt to the banks. So we're going to see an imminent collapse of the banking systems in Europe, and the European banks are the worst placed of almost any. And in the speech that I made, I listed the banks that were broke. You know, Deutsche Bank, Bank Santander, all these banks are actually broke. And we can't go on, or the ECB can't go on protecting them. And of course, they're buying sovereign debt. Who else would buy Italian sovereign debt? I mean, who would buy that? I mean, who would buy that? And what's happening is that they're buying it. They're buying it. You can't do that forever. And when it does collapse, and it will, you'll find that Sweden, Holland, Germany, the Baltic states will realize that they've been legged over while everybody else sucked at the teat in the Mediterranean countries, and they're going to be very cost. Don't forget, this hasn't affected your ordinary working man in Germany so far. Your man that works for Audi or Volkswagen or BMW hasn't felt the draft of this, but the draft is coming, and he will suddenly think, just a minute, what the hell's gone on here? You know, we were a successful business. We've been successful. It's already happening, isn't it? It's already happening. And of course, you've got the green regulations that are coming on top of this. But of course, we can't wait to embrace green regulation. We've got Boris with all the things he's got to worry about with a collapsing economy and all the problems he's got. He's saying, don't worry, when all this is over, we're going to be green. Not what he should be saying is, when all this is over, we're going to dump the green bollocks. That's what he should be saying. Everybody in the pub knows that. Everybody in the world knows that except Boris, who is a moron.
Well, I think he's just obeying orders anyway, Godfrey. I keep seeing things on Twitter where people say, "Oh, we're so disappointed in Boris. He's letting us down." I was like, "Well, why are you surprised? He's a Tory. That's what they do. They kid you up at election time. They get elected, then spend 4 or 5 years doing the opposite of what you want, and then they kid you up the next time, and you vote for them again." So,
I can't put my hand on my heart and say I just haven't voted for over 10 years.
No,
so Boris has nothing to do with me, and neither with Doris, and neither was Cameron before him. Clowns, a lot of them.
I didn't vote in the last general election. There was no point. There was no difference between any of them really in the final analysis. Which kind of brings me on to my last question, because we've had a good go about what's wrong. And my last question to you, Godfrey, we're going to play fantasy politics here. If you were Chancellor of the Exchequer, if somebody rang you up now and said, Godfrey, you know exactly what's wrong. You've got what's wrong with the system. You've analysed it all completely, absolutely spot on. Now, what the hell do we do about it? We'd like you to be Chancellor of the Exchequer and give us a complete recovery plan. Where would you start and what would you do?
I'd start with, there are nearly 1,000 quangos, most of which viewers to this won't have even heard of, but you can look them up. They're actually on the Daily Telegraph website, I think, or Taxpayers Alliance. There are 300 quangos, 900 quangos, and they're responsible for spending somewhere in the region of £300 billion a year. And we've just seen the chief executive of DEFRA leave, whose name escapes me for the moment. We're not only an index-linked pension, she's been given a £500,000 payoff. So we need to stop all that. That's 300 billion off the bat. The unaudited foreign aid that we do, it's working out at something like 12 or 13 billion pounds a year. That obviously needs to go. We need to get rid of indexing pensions, which we talked about earlier. And that all needs to go. We need to cut public sector salaries at 100,000 a year. Salaries of 200,000 and 300,000 a year in the public sector, and they're all infest useless organisations like Public Health England. We've seen how hopeless they are, and all these other quangos. They've all got to go. We've got to reform the national health. We cannot have an NHS system which eats up £120 billion a year with 1.2 million employees, less than half of whom have any medical qualification. That's all got to stop. That's got to stop. So I've just saved somewhere in the region of 400 billion, just like that, a year. 400 billion, just like that, without sacking a single policeman, nurse, doctor, or anything. So we can actually balance the books again. We've then got to have a complete bonfire of regulation. We must bonfire regulations and get ourselves back into a system where anybody who fancies a crack at starting their own business can do so without some health and safety tosser turning up from the town hall inspecting their business when it's only been running a week. I suffered from that when I was first put my own business together in 1992. The first person I saw was somebody from Financial Service Authority. My wife set up a small farm shop thing. The first person she ever saw was somebody from the town hall making sure that the bowl of hot water wasn't too close to the bowl of cold water. All these people have got to go. They've got to go. And we could be a really prosperous economy. And the template, I'll tell you the template for this, believe it or not, Gerard, it's a Conservative administration, the Conservative administration under Lord Salisbury in the late 1880s and early 1890s, which is when we became one of the richest and most powerful countries on the face of the planet, for the simple reason that we understood, and Lord Salisbury, you can look his quotes up in quotation, Oxford Book of Quotations, it is the government's responsibility to make sure that the entrepreneur is facilitated to the best of his ability. That is what government is about, is making sure that the entrepreneur has a clear run at actually building the economy. And that's the guy that matters, not in the way. And at the moment we have governments, and it's not just this country, it's governments all across the world in the Western Hemisphere. In the Western, this is not true of the Far East. In the Western Hemisphere, government sees itself as an impediment to entrepreneurship, not as a facilitator. None of this is difficult, Gerard. None of this is difficult, but it needs somebody with political courage, personal courage, moral courage to stand up and do this. And the funny thing is, the irony is, I know nobody in the public sector would vote for him, but he would have the country behind him in spades. And it's my view that Boris, I didn't fall for it, but Boris gave the impression that he would be a laissez-faire prime minister and leave us all to get on with our lives and run our lives. The only person that can really look after your family and run your family best and your loved ones is you, not some prick from Whitehall.
I think yes, you're right. I agree with I think everything you've said. I think when I used to do a study when I was an MEP of how much does the EU cost the UK, and in that I had kind of three pillars for why we should leave. And of course, one you've already talked about, which is deregulation on business, them to employ people, create prosperity, create tax revenue. And the number 2 and 3, of course, was the common agricultural policy, common fisheries policy, because we have allowed ourselves to be governed by people who don't actually want us to have a prosperous agricultural or fishing policy, because it takes business away from them, the French and the rest of the continentals. And I think agriculture, I think there are some things actually that need to, and perhaps subsidise is the wrong word, but if you want your country to be strong and free, you have to make sure that they function. One of them is the agricultural industry, so that you can produce as much food as you need to within your own country and within your own boundaries in case of any kind of national emergency. And also with the common fisheries policy, which is also now being jeopardised by the current Brexit negotiations, because that is an enormous natural asset that this country's got, which we've allowed to be destroyed by membership of the European Union. And it isn't just about how many fish you can catch and sell. This would regenerate and rejuvenate those coastal towns around the country that have been allowed to fall into decay, because there are lots of ancillary businesses that actually thrive off the back of the fishing industry. And I think that they would be the three main things that if I was Prime Minister, I'd be saying, Godfrey, go away and sort those three things out, which I don't think either of us are going to be in that position. A lot of people have talked to me over the last few years about these very issues and sound money. And one of the things I said, Godfrey, is, well, yes, I think you're right in what you're saying, but the trouble is people never vote for it. they'll never vote for this degree of change. The only way that this change will happen is if it's forced by some kind of natural disaster, for want of a better term. And I think if we are headed for a massive recession or depression, it could be, it's going to be very bad, very painful, but it would at least give the opportunity for this kind of resetting of the economy in a positive way, and not resetting in the way that I fear our political elites and financial elites have planned for us. So I think we've covered a lot of ground, Godfrey. Is there anything you'd like to say before we log off? Any final point you'd like to make?
No, I just say I totally take your point and what you've just said. There is only one slight problem, and that is when you see a collapse of society, and I feel that's what is coming down the track towards us, it usually results in a form of totalitarian state, not a free entrepreneurial state. Yeah. I just hope we don't make as a country the same mistake that countries have been making, in modern history. People have got to understand the reason that we're in this mess is because we've had too much government, not too little.
I agree. And I don't know whether you'd agree or not. I mean, I think that the only hope on the horizon for the Western world is if Trump can force through some reforms. I don't know whether we can trust him, but I think that if you can't, then there isn't any other hope, because we are bound for this kind of technocratic, totalitarian socialist, or on the face of it socialist, but it's not really socialist because it's going to be controlled by the mega rich at the top. If he's genuine, we stand a chance. If we don't, nobody's got a damn chance, I don't think.
I think you're right.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, Godfrey. Really enjoyed talking to you. I'm sure that Naughty Step TV would like to ask you back to talk about some other subjects in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For the FD Group, Mr. Bloom, 2 minutes.
I'm a baby boomer. I was born just after the war. We've probably had the longest period of peace and prosperity globally, I would say, from that time. I've put a little bit of modest money away so I can hand something down to my family when I pass on, largely because I've never spent more money than I've earned, and I've been prudent, and I've worked moderately hard. Now, it always seems to me as a complete surprise to politicians how countries get in debt. Let me explain, because I don't think you really understand it. It's because politicians consistently spend more money than they raise in taxation, more money than they can possibly raise in taxation, most of which, in point of fact, they actually waste. The reason we're talking about countries which are broke, and they are broke, is because their ridiculous, ineffective, ignorant politicians consistently spend more money than they can raise, and then they borrow, and they borrow, and worse, they then print money, because politicians and their central banks have a machine which prints money. You do that as a private citizen, and it's a criminal offence. You would go to prison for doing that, and politicians and their central banks do it all the time. Let me explain to you that these countries are broke, and they're broke because of their own stupid leadership and politicians, and it's immoral to ask ordinary taxpayers of any country to pick up the tab for failed politicians and failed banks. They are defaulted. They're broke. For God's sake, let's all of us admit it.
Mr. Bloom? Yes, well, thank you very much. Mr. Goebbels is brandishing his blue card.
You accept the question? Mr. Goebbels, 30 seconds.
Monsieur le Président, j'aimerais savoir si...
President, I'd like to know if Mr. Bloom knows that Spain is less in debt than the UK, that Ireland was under 60% before the banking crisis, and that Ireland, in going to debt to save its banks, saved the money of the British banks.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. I wasn't suggesting my politicians were any less stupid than anybody else. It's an absolute disgrace. And it wasn't even debated in our national parliament to actually rescue these bus banks. If you want to invest in bus banks, do so with your own money, not money from my old age pensioners in Yorkshire on 98 quid a week. You scoundrels.